To review what we did last week, the biggest goal for gospel-driven parents, new birth, right? When they take ownership of their faith, when they consider themselves a Christian, not just because of you as a parent, right? Because this means that for all eternity they're saved. And also, on top of that, it means that God has given them a new heart, right? A heart that will seek to live according to his ways here and now. And so this is what our focus must be as parents, right? Cultivating, shepherding our child's heart to know and love the Lord. The problem is we can't give this to them and they can't obtain it or earn it. It is by God's grace and his grace alone. And this is why first and foremost, we pray, right? The most important thing we can do as parents, gospel powered parenting is prayer. Another thing we must do is we must model our faith, right? We talked about how it's not about perfection. In fact, it's about admitting our failures and showing our personal need for Jesus, right? Showing that showing our children how much we need Christ, not just preaching Christ, but how much we need him as well, and how that impacts everything. That's what they need to see. But it doesn't stop there. How else can we cultivate? How else can we shepherd our child's heart? Today, we're going to be talking about discipline and authority, right? Two ways that we can shepherd our children. For gospel motivated parents, discipline isn't an option, right? Because to discipline is to love. Hebrews 12:6, for the Lord disciplines the one he loves. He chastises every son whom he receives. Proverbs 13:24, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. When we discipline, we imitate our Father, right? The Bible tells us, in fact, that if we don't discipline, we are unloving. So the question is not whether we should discipline or not, but the question is how should we discipline? And that is tricky, right? And I'm sure all of us, not all of us, but I'm assuming that a lot of us have different opinions about this, and it can be touchy, right? We probably grew up, being disciplined in a different way from each other. I believe there is a more effective way and a less effective way. The more effective way takes more time, it takes more patience, it takes more consistency, but I would argue that it's how we shepherd their hearts, right? Before we go into the more effective, what I think is a more biblical way, first let's talk about the less effective way, right? I feel like the more incomplete way. And this is secular discipline. For secular people, they focus on techniques or trends like positive parenting. I went to a parenting class when when Rachel was pregnant with Eliab. We wanted to just be as equipped as possible, and they talked about how to solve temper tantrums, right? When your child is screaming, rolling on the floor, what they said to do was ignore and distance yourself so that they know that this behavior won't be tolerated, right? And then when they calm down, you go back to them to show that this is the acceptable behavior that you like. Other things that they taught is you could do a reward system, right? Where you take away stickers and you give stickers, and then if they get a certain amount, you get a prize. There's nothing wrong with that. I've tried it, and some parts work, some parts didn't. It can be effective, depending on the child. However, I would argue it has to go further, right? Because all these tips focus just on the behavior. And when you change their bad behavior to good behavior, it's only a band-aid. You haven't truly corrected their deep issue. Okay, so let me give you a case study. I want you to think about this scenario. Let's say you have two kids, right, down the line. Without a doubt, what are they going to do? At some point, they're going to fight over a toy. Okay, and they're going to scream and they're going to yell and they're going to snatch it from each other. What do? right? Think about that for a second. What would you do in that situation? Your two kids are fighting over a toy, and they're both, pulling it from each other, maybe even hitting each other because of it. What do you do? Option one, stop it, or else you're both getting hit, right? You better stop that right now. And let me tell you, that is actually very effective because they fear you. But once again, that doesn't get at the underlying problem. Option two, this is my wife's approach sometimes, is who had it first, right? Who had it first? And this is talking about fairness, right? It's more about justice, right? Who had it first? They get to play with it first. But again, this doesn't really get at the heart issue, right? What is the heart issue here? It's not because they're dying to play with this. It's because the other person's playing with it, right? The heart issue is they're both being selfish. They're both not caring about the other person. Both are saying, my happiness is more important than anything else, so I'm going to steal it from you. I get to do whatever I want. And that's why you can't just focus on behavior. You can't just say, okay, stop, time out, and then, both separate, and then that's it. You can't just stop there. And this is where gospel discipline comes in. Oops. Gospel discipline focuses on the heart, right? But we learned last week, and I'm sure all of you know, our children are born sinners, which means the only solution is the gospel working in their hearts. And so what does that mean? Gospel discipline, it is seeing sin through God's eyes, seeing sin for what it deserves, and seeing that there's also forgiveness in Christ, right? So practically speaking, what does that look like? The two books I referenced, Shepherding a Child's Heart, Gospel Powered Parenting, they had a whole bunch of stuff. I condensed it and broke it down to 3 steps that you can really, hopefully, tangibly take away. Okay, so first is the discipline part. When you see a heart issue, disobedience, a sin issue, you discipline. Spilling milk is not a heart issue, disobedience. It's clumsiness, right? If they scratch your car, it's probably not a sin issue, right? They just don't know what is going on. And that's what Tobias did, right? He scratched my car with his toy and he was banging on it. And I just got so angry. And I shouldn't have yelled at him, but I did. But that's not a sin issue, right? I shouldn't discipline in that situation. And so but when it is a sin issue, when you know, and you will know, then you have to discipline. A couple of things. Spanking versus other methods. The books I read, those 2 books, they are complete advocates for spanking is an absolute must. They don't like any other form of discipline. I am for it personally, but I wouldn't go so far as to say, this is the only way. Again, the principle is discipline when you know it's a sin issue. That's the bottom line. Second thing that you want to keep in mind, this must be done without sinful anger, right? Discipline shouldn't be punitive. It shouldn't be vindictive. Rather, it must be done in love. And this means that you shouldn't probably discipline if you're just heated, right? You got to be calm. You got to cool down first, right? It has to be super intentional, very controlled, because then you know that your child knows that this is for their best interest, right? There's not going to be resentment or bitterness, right? They're going to know that, okay, I messed up, you see. So first is discipline. Next, you want to get at the heart. And this can happen before or after discipline. I just put it at number 2, right? God has given all of us a conscience. And so they know, right? Even really young kids know right and wrong. You can straight up ask them when they're old, certainly, what did you do wrong? Do you know why you're about to be disciplined, or do you know why you're going to get disciplined? if they're younger, they can't really communicate yet, you can explain to them, right? I love you, but this is why it was wrong, and your actions have consequences, right? The goal is there needs to be an inner struggle, right? They have to see that their actions were wrong and sinful, right? And the best way is to you want to secure acknowledgement from them of their sin, of their wrongdoing. And then lastly, the gospel, right? Restoration. Yeah, this is so important as well, right? You gotta afterwards, you gotta hug them, tell them that you love them, right? You can give them a chance to respond, like, hey, are you ready to ask for forgiveness? Once again, you can explain it to them, right? Like, hey, look, even though this happened, God treats us so much better than we deserve. You still have two loving parents, right? We're not angry with you. This is for your good. So you can make sure you end with encouragement, right? And making sure that they know everything is okay. Again, you see that this is so much more work than yelling at them and saying, stop, or bribing them, because bribing them works too. And that's so much easier. I'll give you candy if you stop. That'll probably fix it, right? But this is what we have to do to get the real heart issue. Just a few wisdom advice with discipline. It should be age appropriate, right? If you do spank, it has to stop at a certain point, obviously. Discipline will look different for teenagers, right? Obviously, as they get older, more communication needs to be involved. And we'll talk about that later, right? Next week as well. Second, there needs to be consistency, right? If you let some things slide, but then at other times you discipline, it's very confusing, right? It sends a mixed message, right? And your children, they will push your boundaries, guaranteed. And so if you say clean up and you discipline, but then you say, okay, next time you clean up and you don't discipline, they're gonna push that. They're gonna see how far you can go, right? So you want to be as consistent as possible. And then lastly, there needs to be pain, right? Without this, there is no fear or respect. And I think this hurts more for the parents than the children, really, right? We don't want to inflict pain. We want our kids to be so happy. We fear their disapproval. We fear their displeasure. But remember, temporary pain will avoid longer lasting pain, right? Some Bible verse, if you look in the Bible, there's some examples of this, right? 1 Samuel 2:29. Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourself with the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel? 1 Samuel 2:34 later down, he says, and this that shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. Right? Eli should have disciplined his two sons for scorning and misusing their powers, but he didn't. Let him slide. And what happened? Right? God said both of them shall die on that same day. Without discipline, the pains and consequences later down the line, right, can be deadly. And they need to understand. And so they need to understand this message right now. And so that temporary pain, right, avoids longer lasting pain in the future. So that's gospel motivated discipline. It's getting at the child's heart. That's the most important thing. It's not just focusing on changing behavior. But what we really want to do is focus on their hearts. Now let's move to something similar, and that is authority, right? Authority. Romans 13:1-2. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Here it's very clear God has instituted all authority, and that includes parents over children. Exercising the authority given to you by God is a way we shepherd our children's heart, right? Our children need to learn how to receive correction and instruction. Now, this, especially at a young age, right? And this may not sit well with a lot of people, especially in our day and age, right? We want to be friends with our kids. We want our children to be, super independent, to make their own decisions. And so many parents take on the role of advisor, even at a super young age. They're just advising their children, right? Giving them so many options. And when they do this, it is with good intention. But the problem is by the time the kid is a teenager, they're their own authority, right? And no matter how much you plead, they're not going to listen. And so it is important for us to exercise our authority as parents. Parents need to be parents. What does this look like? First, exercising authority means that we discipline rebellion. Rebellion isn't a phase, it's sin. Right? When they refuse to obey you, right there, it's not they're choosing to do that. And they're refusing to obey God's created order. And this needs to be corrected. Books I've read advocate for immediate discipline, right? And so if you say, come here, and they don't listen, I'm going to count to 5. And then they come after 5, after you count down. Then they're going to know that they have a buffer time of 5 seconds before they listen, right? And so I can see the merit of having it be no nonsense. But once again, I'll leave that up to you. Just food for thought. The big thing is you have to discipline this rebellion, right? They have to listen. Second, this means that your child should honor and respect you, right? They cannot order you around, right? They cannot speak to you a certain way. And so you do have to correct this, right? You have to say you cannot speak to mommy this way. You can make requests, but you cannot order, you cannot command us around. Third thing, it means providing instruction. You have to make the unpopular decision sometimes, and they're not going to like it. But hopefully you could teach them why they ought to obey, even when they don't understand, right? Even when they don't want to, because this is what God commands them to do. And if you do this, you set them up for a good life, right? Ephesians 6, 1 through 3, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. If they can't listen to us, they won't listen to anyone in the future, right? At the workplace, if they don't like something, they're just going to quit, get angry. That's how they grew up. There needs to be authority, right? Kids need to learn that they can't get their way all the time. Now, with that said, as they grow older, it becomes less authority and more influence, right? If you have, your teenagers, they go through these stages, they're very moody. Instead of like saying, using authority, right? I'm going to take this phone away from you unless you shape up. You can use influence, right? Like, I feel like you're troubled. Is there something I can help you with? Right? You're asking, how can we learn from this and move forward? And you're trying to influence them rather than just using strict authority, right? You want to be a positive and constructive force, because then when it is something important and ethical and moral, they will know that you are a trusted person that they can come to, right? Knowing that you are there for them in their best interest. A great quote from the book is this: don't waste your influence on things that don't matter. And so what he was saying is, you don't want to correct everything according to your way, right? If they dress a certain way, as long as it's not like too crazy, and you may not understand it, but if it's not a hard issue, it's okay, right? They're hobbies. You can't control and micromanage everything. What's more important is using your authority and influence on hard issues. My dad, he was a huge disciplinarian. My sister never got hit. My older sister, I got hit enough for both of us. Um, when I was growing up, he was not a Christian. So he never talked to me about sin, never really comforted me afterwards. But one thing that he did do right was he was very calm, very intentional when he disciplined. And I always, without a doubt, saw him as an authority figure. And there was a ton of respect and honor that is still there today. Even though it wasn't perfect, no doubt that set me on the right path, right? No doubt that shaped my heart. And I appreciate so much the discipline and authority of my father, right? Without it, I'll just be a complete mess. So to summarize, you want to focus your discipline on changing not just their behavior, but really try to focus on their heart, right? And you do this by disciplining with love, with without anger, and then going further and explaining the sin issue, having them wrestle and understand why this is wrong, and then reassuring them of the forgiveness and restoration. Not only that, but we want to establish our authority from the very beginning so that our kids will learn to receive correction and instruction, and also so that we can have influence and direct them as they get older. So that's two other ways that we can shepherd our child's heart. That's it for the lesson portion. We're going to now move to the discussion portion now. And I wanted to, let's see. I wanted to ask Elder George and Kimmy now to, if you don't mind, there you go. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for being our panelists and for letting us pick your brain. Hearing your life experience, what you may have done differently, what you think that was right, so just sharing your wisdom would be greatly appreciated and so beneficial for all of us. I have a few questions. So first question, I'll throw this to Elder George first. What is your approach with discipline? Did you spank? Did you do something? Well, what did you do for discipline? Yeah, and then how is it just you, or is it Jenny and you? So share with us what is your approach?
So I'm going to preface all this by saying it's one story. Please don't think it's the model. I think everyone has to figure it out for themselves. And as much as you want to be like another person, like, you are who you are. So I'm going to share my story and try to be as candid as I can. There's a lot of facets. Yes, I did choose to spank my kids. It was one of the forms of discipline. Each kid got a different form of discipline. It was very different for each one. Jeffrey, Christina, and Isaac, for those of you know, they all have very distinct personalities. And both, whether they're wayward or rebellious or obedient or quietly stubborn, it was a very big challenge because I had to unlearn the discipline I did with Jeffrey for Christina. And then when Isaac came along, he just threw everything out too. So we made it up as we went. But in terms of what we did for discipline, yeah, spanking was a tool. Finding a consequence, I think we've reached this point now, but back then it was still I'd be lying if it wasn't fear-based and because I said so type of statements. And it evolved as the kids got older, and it's hard to come up with a lot of stories because I feel like every year is a blur. But certainly, what I really loved about the stuff Pastor Simon shared earlier was that there's nothing wrong with instruction and authority and exacting like a specific behavior, because I think eventually their heart will come around to learn what the behavior really is supposed to, like they'll learn the behavior and then their heart will catch up. And so like stealing, selfishness, domineering, calling each other, whatever it was. So yeah, I'm gonna just try to put the brakes on a little and say like I discipline all my kids. They're all different. Each got spanked spanked differently. Some got spanked later on. Like I think Jeffrey, the last time I spanked him, he was like, I'm gonna say like 8 or 9 years old, and then I didn't spank him after that. Christina, maybe similar, maybe even earlier, like 6. And Isaac, he just got away with so much, probably like 4. Like we stopped spanking him, right? So it was just a lot of different things from different kids, and that's. I'll just pause there because I know there's a lot of stories to share.
Thank you. Kimmy, how about you?
Yeah, so like George and Jenny, we spanked our kids too. Not very much. I don't know if it was because they were girls. Um, I when I think about it, it really has to do with, I think, their personalities, because I was not spanked at all as a child. But that's because I think that I had such a strong conscience. I think as an only child, being home alone, oftentimes, and practically like raising myself because my parents were immigrants and working all the time, I think that God's sovereignty, He gave me that very strong conscience so that I felt guilty about every little thing that I did. So, the Holy Spirit was really with me from day one, so that I was very motivated to obey because I felt bad if I didn't. Sang, on the other hand, was beaten because he had no sense of guilt whatsoever. He was spanked all the time, but he was extremely rebellious and disobedient. So we come from very two different discipline backgrounds. So hence we came together and we decided, even before we had kids, how we were going to discipline our kids. Of course, it all, changes completely once you actually have kids. But I would agree with George that discipline looked very different for all 3 girls, because the way that they processed correction or any kind of discipline was very different. I'd say Madison, very much like me, strong conscience. So I just had to tell her once not to do something, and she immediately took it and was sorry and said that she wouldn't do it again. And I really believed her. She very much internalized any kind of discipline that we invoked upon her. Cindy, very different. She more like saying more rebellious type, so we would discipline her, but we knew that we needed to give her a little time and space just to process. So oftentimes I would give her time out, or time just by herself to think about what she's done, and then I would go back and talk with her, or saying would go back and talk with her, and figure all that out once she has calmed down and she is able to think through. And she's still like that even as a teenager. If we have a disagreement or whatnot, oftentimes she will take the time. Could be an hour, it could be a day, and then when she's ready to talk, she'll text me, or we'll talk over text, actually, because she's just a lot calmer and able to think through her thoughts and emotions that way. And then Audrey is kind of in between, where she could receive the discipline, and she would need to mull over it for a short period of time, and then she was ready to like hug and kiss and make up and be done with that. Yeah, all 3 very, very different. But for us, when they were little, thinking about, before they could talk or their real young years, we use the memo stick quite a bit. We didn't actually have to use this memo stick, and the memo stick meaning it could be a chopstick, it could be, whatever instrument, but just the threat of it. Okay, do you want me to take out the memo stick? Is all we had to say, and they would shake their heads, and that's all we needed to do. So I think that I've probably spanked my girls once, maybe twice at the most. Saying would say that maybe about 2-3 times as well. So we barely had to actually physically enforce discipline, but again, just the threat of that memo stick was super, super powerful. And then again, the different types of timeouts. Madison not needing it, Sydney definitely needing an extensive timeout, and Audrey somewhere in between.
Yeah, I can definitely relate. Eliab, my firstborn, he has a very if you say like you hurt me, he'll feel it as well. Tobias, if you say you hurt me, he'll like laugh at you. Like he does not care at all, at all. And so yeah, it's so different with your kids, depending on your kids. Here's one problem that I always run into. Where do you draw the line with discipline? And what I mean by that is, let's say they do a simple lie, or they fudge the truth. At what point is it like, punishment fits the crime? I think that's generally how we approach it. But yeah, was there a point? Was there some measurable, I don't know, standard that you guys had? What are some other forms of discipline that was effective for you guys, that you use for like maybe something small versus something bigger? Elder George?
Yeah. So spanking definitely was like the last resort, and if it got to a point where like the reason and the talking ceased to make any effect, I think I'm being confessed, it's a little bit of a blur what I did when they're younger. Like now when they're like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and older, it's easy to like talk and convey the harm that they did and the effect it had on someone else, usually a sibling or myself or Jenny. And so, but when they're younger, I feel like we tried our best to, but that kind of goes to a lesson I think every parent needs to learn, which is, can you manage your own temper? Because like there's no rationality if you're pissed, because then there's no crime fitting the punishment. There just needs to be punishment. And so this is where like there has to be a lot of personal growth to get rid of some insecurities, because the times that where the punishment was just like totally like out of left field, not tied to the crime, were the times where you just saw red. And so I would say like those times where you can keep your cool, you probably are going to find a good discipline. But those times where like something triggered and you just lost it, nothing makes sense. And in those moments, like sometimes like there has to be like physical separation. Like parent has to go somewhere else too. But yeah, I can't say I had any like strong framework per se.
Kimmy, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, just again, like we talked about our first session, the importance of communicating with your child. I think even with either wrongdoing, I just tried to be consistent about nipping it in the bud right away. So if behavior that I didn't like, that needed to be corrected, like on the spot, of course, situational, depending on the situation. But as much as possible, I tried to talk about the issue right then and there and correct it. But then there are other times when, if we're at a party or there's a large group of people around us, where I would have to say, we are going to talk about this later. But I just made sure that I always addressed it. So I just wanted my children to understand that they would not get away with anything. And so I just tried to be super consistent about addressing whatever sin, whatever wrongdoing was manifested, because I just felt like, yeah, they needed to know that God was always watching them. I was always watching them, that they cannot get away with anything, and that even it, and I've told them this before as well. If by chance I ever miss anything that you've done wrong, that God is watching too. And so that was very effective for the high conscience child, the guilt-ridden child, because Madison was always like, oh my God, God is always watching. So that helped to steer her the right way, for sure. Yeah.
What when they were younger, is what you did? You said you spanked. You said you talked to them. Is there anything else that you did? Like, did you do, I don't know, the sticker formula where you take away stuff, or timeouts, the hand raising? What did you guys do?
Well, my girlfriend had 3 boys. She pinched. So every time they did something bad, so it was never a spank, but she would go and she would just pinch them really hard. And that was super effective for her. So, different methods for different folks. For,
That
boys.
brings bad memories. My mom pinched me all the time. Like, even when I'm like an adult, like she just still does that. I didn't find timeouts effective. We did do them like any parent did. I'm not sure. It's hard to say. I don't know if I got results, but it was a moment for them to calm down. It was a moment for me to calm down, us to calm down, me and Jenny. But it's hard to know whether that was effective as a recourse or punishment.
Is there anything that you guys would have done differently? Do you think that you should have disciplined more looking back, or maybe it was too harsh? And yeah. So for us, as we're all very young parents, um, yeah. So is there something that you would go, if you could go back in time and do over? Is there something that you would?
My comment's going to be more tied to the person, like you, the adult. And it would be about introspecting about how you were disciplined, whether and understanding the fear or the authority or whatever it was that drove it. And then also to examine like what moments make you lose it as a parent, and to dive into that a little, whether it's they embarrassed you, they questioned your authority directly or publicly, which also embarrassed you, and to kind of get at understand that more, because I felt like discipline in our household, what we could take back were the moments where we lost it, and I think it was because, and I don't even know if like we've conquered that, they've just outgrown their behaviors, but I think those moments where like, God, forgive me, forgive us, like were the moments where we just didn't know what triggered us, and we said things we shouldn't have said. We may have spanked a little harder than we should have. Um, but yeah, and I find like, that's not their sin. That was my sin, or our sin, me and Jenny's sin. And that's like one thing, like as parents, we should always be on the lookout to grow.
Yeah, I agree with George in that, those times when I discipline my kids out of anger because they embarrassed me or they made me look bad as a parent. So that's my own pride issue, right? Of wanting to appear a certain way, like a good mom, in front of other people, in front of strangers sometimes, right? And instead of really focusing on the heart of my child, of wanting to change your heart, and correct it for the good. And so yes, definitely, like always, I think checking my own heart as a parent of why I'm disciplining my child at that very moment. And I think when I think back, something that we do now that I wish we did more of when they were younger is this whole idea of redo. When, the girls as teenagers, they're often throwing attitude at each other, right? They're often showing disrespect to each other. They don't show disrespect to Sing and I because they know that we won't tolerate it, but to one another, there's a whole lot of bickering and fighting. And so something that we've been encouraging them to do is to do the redo. Like it's kind of like your chance to go back and say something differently. And it's become, I don't know, I guess we do it so often that it becomes a joke now, like a laughing matter. Like the other day, Sydney saw Audrey's hair and said, wow, your hair looks crazy, right? And Audrey was so offended. Oh my God, why you're talking about my hair? I just woke up. And then Audrey called out, oh, redo. And then Sydney's like, oh, just you have the hair of a mane. And so they've learned to kind of laugh about it. But the idea is that it just brings peace, like instant peace. And it also helps the speaker to think about, okay, what's my meaning and how can I say it different so it's not offensive. And so I think as like little kids, we need more of that. It's not only telling them what not to do, but then showing them, well, how do you say it then? Okay, if this is an improper way of saying something and it's offending my friend or my sibling or whatnot, how should I say it then? And so teaching them more about that. It's this idea of modeling and showing them the proper way of saying maybe the same thing, same meaning. So yeah, I would say that your kids are young, a lot of them not speaking yet, but just maybe keep that in the back of your mind that as they start to talk and interact more with others, and if they start to fight or whatnot, to be able to kind of address like, okay, well, I know what you wanted to say, but how could we say it in a nicer way? Do that replay that redo again and again. I think that's a really nice way of teaching your child, a different way of doing things, a peaceful way of interacting with others.
Oh, I love that. That's great. This is my last question. So if you guys have questions, feel free to jump in after this. Where is it how has the discipline changed for you, Elder George? Right now, what does it look like? And then for Kimmy, are you still kind of monitoring? I mean, Madison's now in college, so I don't know how much you do now. Is it more of just I don't know, let them be on their own? So Elder George, how is it for you?
Yeah, definitely this time, like Isaac is 8, Christina's 10, and Jeffrey's 12. So we've escaped the dark years of like toddlerhood and no rational thought and just raw emotion. So it often will take the form of conversations. And for Jeffrey, definitely those conversations have elements of the things you mentioned, which is like, my job is here because God made this, so it's like teaching in the framework of authority and like, I'm here to guide you. God gave me this job. Here's what happened. And just having that, ability, whether it's influence or just shaping the world for him. My conversations with him are definitely more like serious, or when they do happen. Because I'm not going to say like they're all serious. Sometimes like, you're not like, get off the laptop. Like we told you. So it's not all like calm and rational, but definitely there's the times where it's a very like in-depth conversation. Starting to do that more with Christina too. She's 4th, 5th grader. And again, with Isaac, he just kind of gets the leftovers. He's also my good kid. Like he's very obedient. He's mischievous, but he doesn't try to rebel. So he definitely just kind of glides along, and Christina and Jeffrey get the brunt of it. But definitely, like I said, I haven't spanked them in years. I don't even know what a memistic is. I did have a pretty solid one too. The conversations happen, and it's not even daily, because usually daily, as they bicker, and it's usually like a terse word or something, and so I'm not even sure that's the right way to go about it. But when it does happen and get to a serious level, it's usually a one-on-one conversation. There's definitely elements of the Bible, and just kind of frame it all under the sense of, like, what was right, what was God wanting, what did sin do for us here.
Is it both you and Jenny that do that?
So Jenny, to some degree, I think the calm, serious conversations are more what I do. Jenny definitely is like there. She's there during the day, so she's policing nonstop. But when it's like a more, I think it's like 30-70, 40-60, she'll definitely do it. But I definitely have a bulk of like those serious conversations.
Kimmy, what about you? How does it look like now?
Yeah, I mean, when you talked about, getting to the heart, definitely, like that's my stage right now, is always addressing the heart issue. So it's I think for me, like I'm really trying to help them to be more self-aware of why they do the things they do. And so we have a lot of discussions about that. It's not just about the behavior, the bad behavior in and of itself, but always bringing it back to, well, why did you do that? What made you do that? How did you feel about doing that? And so I ask a lot of questions and have them just really think through. I mean, with Madison, she's always, I think that she has naturally just a lot of self-awareness. So I feel like she kind of corrects me more than I correct her nowadays. But with Sydney, yeah, definitely. Like for Sydney, she, again, like her dad, doesn't like being lectured to. She kind of has this natural like rebellious nature. And so what I find works with her is that, again, it's just bringing it back to the Bible. So, instead of just lecturing her and nagging her about certain things, if I see like a kind of reoccurring behavior, like a bad attitude or whatnot, we'll have our one-on-one time and we'll read through scripture, and I intentionally find scripture that kind of addresses whatever behavior issues she's going through. The Bible is really amazing for that. And so when she reads it and she sees that, oh my gosh, it's God telling me, that my behavior is wrong, and it's the Bible correcting me, then she's just open and she is readily accepting the correction. And so I give it to the Lord. Honestly, it's like I don't really have to do a whole lot of disciplining anymore. I find that guiding Sydney through scripture does the job at her age. So, very age appropriate as a college student. And Audrey too. I mean, if there's any kind of eye rolling, and I mean, I still have to correct some of those things, but I, again, try to nip that in the bud right away. There is no disrespect to adults whatsoever. It's never tolerated. So wherever we are, whatever we do, I just, I look at her with my evil eye, and she knows, okay, yeah, I I showed attitude, not allowed. So, so yeah, I would say that that's where they are with their stages right now.
I'd like to clarify one thing for myself. Like, I made it sound very polished, and a lot of, so like, I'd say, I just want to give some quantities to like the type of discipline. I'd say 80% of my discipline these days, or me and Jenny, is like, no dessert. You just lost 30 minutes of screen time now. You wanted to watch a movie? Go to bed. Like, I don't want to make it seem like I have this very refined, like 80% of my discipline is like, there was a reward and now there isn't. The other part of it is like, when it gets to like this level where there was harm to another person, whether it's like emotional or physical, then like those are the times where like, let's talk, let's really hash this out. But like I'm in a stage where like maybe for the last few years, couple of years since like first grade for Isaac, like the discipline has largely been like withholding rewards, and it's not so much like a a lecture or, and definitely not a spanking. But I just want to give some clarity on like what it actually looks like for me.
Yeah. Thank you.